Thank you so much, Emma. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining. First, all things to do is to introduce Simon. Simon, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Dom. Yeah, thanks very much. Really, real pleasure to be with you today. Yeah, I'm Simon Hodgkinson. I'm the former Chief Information Security Officer for BP. And that was the global CISO accountable for IT and OT security. So everybody who had a cyber badge worked in my organization. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of interaction, I'm sure, between the IT cyber people and the OT engineers through this conversation. I retired at the end of 2020, and now I do advisory work with a number of cyber companies, and also do some consultancies as well, consultancy work.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. I'm sure you've got lots of interesting stories and anecdotes to share with us. Myself, for those who've not, if here on the first time, not encountered me before, I'm the Director of Portfolio Marketing. So I look after and execute our threat detection response services strategy, because we are, of course, a SOC as a service provider. I've been doing products and service development for around 20 years, coming up for 10 years in cyber. I work in tech for about 30 years and on various projects at various places around the globe. But let's move on to what we're going to talk about today. So as we have done with the previous webinar, we're going to recap what we've talked to date very quickly. Then we're going to jump into it. So we're going to look at OT response planning and what goes into that. In terms of the business of risk, how to manage the different challenging priorities from a business angle, from all the competing priorities in terms of what to do when things are surfaced. Going to get down into a little bit of technical bits with vulnerability mapping, threat intelligence integration, what that brings to the table, and then, as always, close off with a bit of a look at what upcoming regulatory obligations mean for this particular topic and how they're impacting it. So without further ado, let's just do a quick recap. So we've talked so far about, it's in webinar 1, because we went deep into why it's important to have asset discovery, visibility, management, to be able to kind of detect when there's kind of a variance from basically the baseline of what you have, the assets, what that means in terms of how you can build on that with not just anomaly detection, but then in webinar 2 went deep into getting proper threat detection in place, and how both of those kind of contribute to what your obligations for different parts of upcoming cybersecurity resilience bill, CAS 2, IEC 62443. We'll look at that a bit again today. So there's another interesting report come out recently from, I think, some Dragos about the financial risks of OT security. There's kind of numbers in there about what that means in terms of the downtime, the business interruption, financial impact, and kind of numbers, various numbers depending on long tail or the immediate impacts. But 31 billion is a big, scary number. And North America, Europe, UK are kind of hotspots as targets for adversaries. So I guess if you want to coin a kind of cliche phrase around it, you could say this business interruption through cyber attacks becoming an economic weapon of mass disruption. That's obviously the one we want to avoid, and we're going to kind of look at ways we can kind of seek to overcome those challenges. So just to recap where we are. So we've covered asset control, we've covered threat detection, and we're kind of going to get into kind of threat protection and response part of this kind of the OT security, and kind of combining that with IT. So prepare for the worst. Obviously, we want to hope for the best, but hope's not a strategy. So we kind of want to prepare for the worst, plan for the worst. What does that mean? So tabletop exercises are a kind of common activity for businesses that kind of want to exercise disaster recovery plans. And in the cyber world, we see kind of that's becoming more and more of a thing in the IT world. But I think there's kind of nuances and differences in how that's approached, and kind of how some of the findings and the outcomes are handled in the world of OT, and when it's kind of unified IT and OT, and then obviously there's a various discussions, mediations, compromises potentially have to be made. So I've extracted some of the key components, kind of phases from a typical tabletop exercise. Obviously, there's a lot more planning up front and scenario planning and kind of follow-ups afterwards. But in terms of the kind of key activities, objectives, we've got scenario injections, kind of put some threats in there, how can investigate containments, and so on. So Simon, I know you've kind of run through some of these in your illustrious career. What does scenario injection really mean in an OT environment? Because in an IT environment, we'd be putting kind of potentially, threats in there to see if we could detect them. Is it a similar story?
Yes, I think from a tabletop exercise perspective, first and foremost, Dom, a lot of people look at this as a cyber IT and engineering exercise. In my experience, the best way to start this is actually to start with the very top of the house, so that you actually do it at the executive level, because actually cyber is just a business risk, whether it's in the IT side of the house or the OT side of the house. So in terms of if you look at the companies, I mean, you could take things like Jaguar Land Rover at the moment. You can't really disconnect IT and OT from business impact. What we did, we ran quite a few different. We're very blessed to have great support from the top of the house in BP, and therefore we managed to run 5 or 6 cyber exercises with the executive teams. One of those was specifically engineered around the OT environment. So the background to it was essentially a PLC had malicious software. It caused a fire at a competitor's refinery. We couldn't be sure whether that was the cause or something else. And so the inject there was, actually, do we have the PLC in our environment? And of course, the answer to that question was, at the time, well, give me a day or so, and I'll phone up all the asset owners, and hopefully they've got an inventory which actually has those PLCs in them, and then we can tell you which assets would be impacted. And of course, that wouldn't have been the case in a real incident, but actually the whole idea was to get really smart people to ask you really intelligent questions. So that inject about a PLC having malware on it actually forced a couple of things. One was actually the whole asset inventory conversation, and the fact we didn't have a central asset register of everything in the OT environment. And remember, BP was a pretty mature environment from OT security as well, but we didn't have that. And the second one was really around decision rights. So, I walked into the room and said, I've separated, the network, segmented the network for all the OT assets from IT, because I didn't want lateral spread from OT into IT, or indeed from OT into OT, through the network architecture. And one of the questions that was raised was, one of the statements that was raised was, you're not allowed to do that. And actually what it amplified was the fact that actually I had delegation of authority through our governance system to make that call. So again, that forced a conversation about who's got the authority, and I see a lot of organizations I work with haven't figured that question out yet, and that will create massive delays in those exercises. So I raise those two as sort of injects that can really actually drive material change in your maturity around responding to an OT event should it happen.
Fascinating. So, I mean, I think you kind of covered a bit of investigation and containment there as well. I mean, for me, containment in OT and kind of the operational decision making around safety, etc. We're going to dive into that quite a bit. Is that something that throws up a lot of previously unknowns when you kind of really get into those scenarios typically?
Yeah, spot on. I think one of the things that came out of one of the exercises was exactly that. What would happen if we segmented the network? So if we shut down access between IT and OT, in theory, if if the design was implemented perfectly, nothing would happen, and the assets would continue to operate safely. They would continue to operate within operational parameters for a period of time that would allow us to, make sure we've got things contained before we reopened that network connectivity. The interesting thing is we hadn't tested it. So actually, out of those exercises, we again another major success was the fact that actually that would have been a decision I would have made if the incident was real in BP. I would have absolutely made that decision to sever the networks, and therefore we would have done that blind. So actually, we went through a role of disconnecting. And there were two reasons for that. One, obviously, does the assets continue to operate safely and within normal operational parameters? And the second thing was to find out whether there was any traffic still coming in and out of the OT environment, because engineers are really smart and they just want to get their job done. And cyber folk, often the response is to put hurdles in the way, because the two didn't necessarily meet in terms of hearts and minds, and therefore, you wanted to make sure that actually, if you did sever that segmented network, that actually it was properly severed. There wasn't other ways that traffic was going to get back into your environment. So that was a great win as well.
I mean, were you able to actually? Were you digital twinning, so to speak, in terms of being able to actually create an environment where you could unplug it and see what happened, or is it just based on deep knowledge of the environment, all brought together in one room where you could challenge each other? Or?
It was a bit of both. One was the design was designed to be able to do that, and we then built on that capability that at an individual asset level we could sever them all if we wanted with pretty much the click of the button. But actually, no, we actually did it physically. We had an incident call set up, and had the team actually turn down the network and make sure that the asset continued to operate. Because actually, in reality, those things could happen in normal operational environments, especially where you got rigs in the middle of the ocean, or you got ships on the water, which are often disconnected for time as well. So you in a normal operational model, you could lose that access. But the question we wanted to ask ourselves is, in an incident, could we actually physically turn all of those connections down and know that those assets wouldn't have a safety or availability issue?
So it's in terms of that kind of last point on the slide, the recovery and restoration planning. I mean, that's where we get into a lot more business continuity, disaster recovery type scenarios, where obviously you're planning ahead and you understand the redundancy and the failover capability of different components and what happens where you switch things off. So I guess everything you've learned, you kind of updated your existing BCDR processes in a way.
And I think, and back to that point, you can't separate. Again, we do tend to separate IT and OT, but actually in today's digital world, that is hard to do. You create the segmentation so you're able to, if you need to, but the reality of today's modern world is there's an enormous amount of telemetry comes out of those environments that you want to use to optimize processes. And therefore, actually, if you looked at something like Colonial Pipeline, Colonial Pipeline shut down the pipeline. The reality was they didn't need to. It was an attack on the logistics systems, which was in the IT world. So actually understanding that end-to-end business process. So if you want to get oil out the ground, what is the end-to-end business process is important. And I'll give you another example of that. So, back in the day, we had strikes. We used to own Grangemouth Refinery. We had strikes in Grangemouth Refinery from tankers drivers. So we couldn't get product out the environment. and therefore we had to stop production. So there's that physical world, that you've got business continuity plans in terms of the end-to-end supply chain, but you've also got the logical world. If those logistics systems aren't there to be able to fill the tankers to get them out the refinery, then you're just backing up the processes to the point where you have to either slow down or stop production. So you've got to think about this as what is the outcome you're trying to achieve, and what are all the process steps in order to do that. And that involves typically IT. Well, it always involves IT and OT.
Yeah, that business context is a recurring theme that keeps coming up. So I think it's worth kind of moving on to kind of look at what that means in terms of decisions that are made, and the different potential views you've got at different parts of the organization and how they view that. Obviously, on this, the kind of the board, the executive, kind of want to make sure, obviously, revenue is not impacted too severely, everything's compliance, shareholders are happy, and so forth. Whereas your traditional cyber risk owner is very much about making sure data remains protected, nothing kind of escapes, and critical systems are available. And your OT risk owners, it's kind of primary focus. We kind of touched this a few times across the series. Operational uptime, safety, and kind of primary concerns. Have you kind of experienced any deviation from that, or any friction between the two competing primary focuses in kind of your career?
Yeah, I laugh because absolutely, and anybody who's worked in IT and OT security, you will know there's a big cultural difference. It's the gap has closed a lot now, thankfully. But actually, in the early days, you had cybersecurity experts who were applying IT security principles to OT, and the reality is those two things are very, very different. In the IT world, you were thinking a lot more about things like confidentiality, integrity, and in the OT world, you're thinking about safety and availability. So the classic is, and we came across this a lot, is Windows vulnerability, critical vulnerability, you got to get it patched. And people from the cyber world telling the OT engineers, you got to patch it in 24 hours. When the reality is that is nonsensical, because a lot of the OEMs won't have had chance to actually prove whether the patch is supportable. So the last thing you want to do is step out of a line of pre-approved configurations that might cause process disruption, might cause a safety issue. And what you typically put in place, and what I hope most organizations put in place, are compensating controls. So that's where you get into, robust network segmentation, really robust remote access solutions, and a lot of also physical controls as well. So the age-old people turning up with USB sticks to do maintenance. You've got to make sure those things don't happen, or if they do happen, those things are cleaned properly. So you have to take a whole different world of how you address the cyber risk in the OT environment. And when we took it to probably a bit further than most organizations, I was blessed to have an ex engineer, a guy called Ian Henderson, who led what we called the OT Center of Excellence, and basically it was a combination of people like Ian, who could talk with engineers who had done the job, who was also a cyber expert, plus a team of people who had both OT and IT expertise. So that then you could actually really talk about risk management, not about the sky's going to fall in because you've got thousands of vulnerabilities in your OT environment, because most of those vulnerabilities, in fact, pretty much all of them, were unexploitable unless you had really motivated state-sponsored adversaries. Your script kiddies, your typical financial crime cyber criminals just wouldn't have the dedication or indeed the capability to get past those compensating controls, and if they did, to know what they're doing in that OT world to create disruption. So you have to take a completely different view of risk, and we actually ended up reporting risk in the cyber risk in OT through our safety and environmental committee, which went up to the board, obviously. We called it the Global Operational Risk Committee, and we reported IT through the typical route for cyber, which is the Audit and Risk Committee up to the main board, and then it would come together once a year in totality. But we very much focused on the cyber risk to the business. What is the likelihood of a major accident occurring because of cyber? And in the IT world, of course, it was different. But the two did need to come together because of this notion you have to look at the business outcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of scenario injection as part of the tabletop exercise and the risks uncovered, I guess if you got asked a question, have you rehearsed a scenario where safety, compliance, and revenue kind of in tension with each other? It sounds like kind of exactly what you described, where yes, we understand those scenarios and we know how to balance the different competing priorities potentially, and how to make sure we can take a sensible decision around how best to deal with that risk.
Yeah, for sure. And it's that they are scenarios, right? So in the middle of a real incident, of course, you have to deal with what's in front of you. You have to make those tough decisions about what's in front of you. But at least by going through tabletop exercises and rehearsing those things, you flesh out things. I mean, they may sound really basic,
Yeah.
but the majority of organizations I talk to, who would make that call? Who would make the decision to actually sever the connection between OT and IT for your assets? And most people would say, well, we'd have to get the incident call together. We'd have to get senior execs. It's too late. It's too late. If you've been hit, you want to make those calls immediately. So you better be clear about who's got the decision authority so that they can make that call very, very quickly. And it may be wrong. You may make the call, and I've done that in the past where I've made the call in the IT world to sever a network connection that actually caused a business outage. But I didn't get lambasted for that because I made the decision in good faith with the data I had at my hand at that point. So but if you don't have that authority, you're going to be looking around the room saying, well, who's going to make that judgment call? And it's just too late. So you've got to work those things out through sort of tabletop planning, through scenarios. What happens in the event you get a NotPetya type event that necessarily hasn't gone into the OT world, but your entire communications capability has disappeared. So everybody's reliant on Teams or Zoom or whatever, Google, whatever your choice of platform. There are many out there, and so what is your process then for communicating? How do you know that those assets are continuing to run safely? How are you getting that information back? When would you have to shut them down? Is there a point 24 hours, 48 hours where if you haven't got the data coming back into the OT into the IT environment, or back to the case I used earlier, the logistics systems aren't there to move the product so that things you get backed up, and therefore you have to make a decision to shut down. You have to think through all of those things, and I think we're fairly still very, very immature in our industry around really thinking about those worst case scenarios with the likelihood is low, but the impact is enormous. Now, obviously BP had significant events where we experienced that, where safety critical controls, multiple ones failed at the same time. So we were well versed in looking at those very low probability but massively high impact events.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how some of the things that until they happen, you don't think about, can kind of bring bring things to a halt. Obviously, everyone's very focused on supply chain at the moment and understanding if something, a few steps downstream goes off, how will that impact, as you say, moving product and the logistics. But yeah, just simple being able to communicate because the communication system's down and not, people being geographically dispersed. What do you do in that situation? It all really needs playing out. Interesting to hear that so you've experienced having to make a decision which brought the business offline. I guess that kind of really shaped your approach to how you kind of did tabletops and planning from that point forward in terms of having had a baptism of fire, so to speak.
Well, absolutely, but it was pre Petra and WannaCry when we did the initial tabletop exercise, and we'd fleshed out things like decision rights, and that was critical. And I was blessed to take over the CISO role after a guy called Daniel Barriuso, and Daniel had done an amazing job of getting the board and the executive team on board to even have the conversation about sort of delegations of authority. But without that, in that particular incident, it was the wrong decision, but it was the right decision with the information that I had at hand. That confidence to be able to make that call in the knowledge that you had that delegation is really important. It's a really simple, it seems like a really simple thing, but the amount of people I talk to where the CISOs or who is ever if it's not the CISO, whoever else is in charge of the OT/IT stuff, if so many people just don't know. They would go to a crisis management meeting, wait for that to be stood up. You know how long that will take. First of all, most people wouldn't even know the telephone numbers of the people they got to call if they had a NotPetya type event. They would have to scramble around and figure out how to get people on some kind of bridge because they haven't pre-prepared a communications platform. People say, "Oh, we'll go to WhatsApp," but how do you have all the numbers? Do you know how to manage that in the event? Most people don't. You've got to do the pre-work to really understand what it's going to take in the event of a catastrophic incident, so that you can make those judgment calls. And I'll come back to that. Might be in the IT world, but it will impact the OT world. So you can't separate the two things. You have to look at what is the business outcome you're trying to achieve and the end-to-end process and all of the technology landscape that underpins that.
Brilliant. Yeah. So let's I think that's a good segue into kind of jumping into some of the more technical aspects of it and have a little bit of a look at vulnerability management, threat intelligence, how that can inform and feed, but also potentially some of the challenges across that, catching everything across the IT and the OT environment. So I put together a kind of a very simplified steps of how we assess incoming CV disclosures, vulnerability disclosures, new threat intelligence. Let's go. You need to understand how critical that is for your organization in context. Is it being actively exploited? Is it going after a whole sector? Do we need to look at the supply chain? Those things. So the MITRE attack map there for ICS. Typically, processes, it's which of the tactics and sub techniques and techniques might we be vulnerable to if this was being exploited in the attack chain. Is this already protected through countermeasures that we talked about earlier? And it's going to question then if that is the case. Obviously, it becomes more urgent. But yeah, the considerations of what to do next. Like I say, it's those considerations. Focused on safety first of all. Typically in the OT world, keeping the business up. What do we have to do in terms of making sure we fulfil regulatory obligations, reporting time, etc. And now, when are the typical maintenance windows that we can do something if we decide we need to? Potential outcomes you may avoid. You talked about countermeasures. Unplugging things, segmenting networks, taking VLANs off, stopping communications between IT and OT is to be a common one. Obviously, it's triggering a threat hunt to kind of look for signals in the environment. Obviously, it's kind of standard stuff. Maybe creating new analytics for detection engineering. And then if and when the chance permits, if it's deemed necessary to keep the business safe, patches or firmware updates. But those in the OT world are a big thing, aren't they?
Huge. It's really difficult, and like I said, you don't want to step out of line with the OEM vendors, because this is safety critical, process critical stuff that if suddenly you slap on an AV agent, or you upgrade a Windows device, or indeed any device in that environment that doesn't align with their approved versions, then you have no idea. It's so sensitive, so any minor disruption could really upset the process. So you have to be very sensible, and I'll come back to that's where things like compensating controls come in, and making sure, not everybody does, but making sure when you're designing the technology for the OT world, those good old basic foundational controls that need to be put in place. You've got to have good network segmentation. You've got to have robust access controls, remote access controls, making sure that you've got jump servers, bastions, privileged access workstations, whatever it is that just makes it very, very, very difficult to get into those environments. And making sure as well you don't push anything into the environment that actually could create disruption. So things like anomaly detection engines, making sure that anything you put in that environment is not going to create any noise on the network that would cause any disruption. So you have to think through very carefully, but you don't have to act quickly. Typically in that environment, you have to act thoughtfully. You have to be really sensitive to this is a safety and a process availability challenge, not an integrity, confidentiality, and an availability thing that you've got in the IT world, because you've done your job to make it so difficult. And you also, Dom, it's worth again saying that what is the most motivation for people to attack the ICS environment? It's not your traditional criminal gangs for looking for sort of financial motivation. It's normally somebody trying to create disruption, and that's typically a state actor or somebody with very, very highly sophisticated capabilities. So you're not going to get the barrage of attacks you get from all of these threat actors in the world. It will be very limited. So having good threat intel is important, but recognizing that it's very different from IT threat intel as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the compensating controls. In the previous webinars, we kind of drilled into the Purdue model quite a lot, and understanding the kind of not just the network topology aspects of it, but the control separation and the permission separation, and understanding where a vulnerability might exist in the different Purdue levels. Obviously, has a very different creates different thinking about how you might address that. If it's already protected by those compensating controls, it's really difficult for anyone to kind of get anywhere near it anyway. That gives you a bit of confidence that you can deal with it in the right time when the time becomes available.
The one thing I would say is that you've also got to remember that these assets typically run it's a very different life cycle. So IT assets, 3 to 5 years, typically refresh cycles. OT assets, 10 to 15 years, maybe. It's also, you've got to think about the risk. I always say this, business is always about managing risk. So, the boards and the executive teams, that's their job, is to manage business risk. And our job, when we go in with the state of things like in the OT security, is to make it clear that actually, yes, there's a lot of legacy stuff out there, but for these compensating control reasons, the impact could be high, but the likelihood is very low, because we've put all of these controls in place to stop bad things happening. I'll come back to, you've also got to make sure that you treat the sort of people process and technology aspect of that as well. I said about USB 6 and OEMs walking in and plugging their laptops in. You've got to stop all of that stuff. But you really need to look at the narrative being, yes, there's a load of tech debt in these environments, but for these reasons, the likelihood of those things happening is fairly limited. So actually, the fact that you have to wait months, sometimes years, for a maintenance window to put the upgrades in is actually okay. And I always say, if I had $1, most businesses have got constrained funding to spend on anything, but say, let's call it talking about risk. And in that OT environment, if I had a corroding pipeline or I had a Windows 2000 server, I know where I'd spend my $1. I would spend it on the corroded pipeline, and I'm the cyber expert. Because actually the likelihood of that causing an event an impact in the environment is higher than is having a Windows 2000 server there.
Yeah, I mean that's such a pertinent point about the pipeline versus the server and what's going to have the most impact and what's likely to be impacted sooner. Just going to bring the kind of the vulnerability management piece to life a little bit with just kind of seeing how that looks in kind of a typical, our platform. So we've kind of gone through assets and threat detection using this on the last couple of webinars. I just want to kind of look into, it comes back to assets again, where we can see which ones may have vulnerabilities. So if we kind of want to see in kind of our layer 2 area, for example, what's at risk. We can say that kind of got the complete asset view, everything in layer 2 on the Purdue model here. You can see one's got vulnerabilities detected and kind of drill into that. Say, okay, some CVEs, and then you want to kind of say, okay, there's a critical one here, and that's what's really bad. And you've got all the information supporting what that CVE is and how it might be potentially attacked. But I think the key thing is, so to go back to the dashboard. Get to the Purdue view from here. Then we can see obviously at layer 2 we've got all the protections in place in terms of where the traffic's flowing. I mean, that asset's here highlighted in red again. And yeah, having that being on top of your asset management, your discovery, the vulnerability of those assets and where they are in the network, I think kind of gives that kind of accelerates that capability to understand what may need addressing, what may not. Kind of as a helpful kind of view. Another potentially useful things is going to the purple team, and look at the attack sims. So here we can kind of look through if as part of that scenario injection during the tabletop exercises, wanting to do a bit of a digital twin. We kind of add copies of the network traffic. We can kind of play through kind of different scenarios in there in terms of what would we pick that up across the infrastructure? Would our detections pick that up? You'll see kind of what the different things that would be injected in, and we'd be looking for different detections. So that kind of would help from a technical scenario injection perspective. And then see in terms of what to do when we are seeing things, having the right response playbooks in place. So if we're seeing, say, a credential compromise on a HMI, pretty serious. What do we want to make sure we can do to detect that happening? In terms of understanding being able to kind of do the containment on it, what the steps are for containment, steps for eradication, recovery, getting all that in place and detecting what's missing from those and having a kind of visuals as part of your tabletop exercises, scenario planning, recovery and response planning. Things to bear in mind that will kind of help understand where you are. I think I think obviously the first steps, if you don't have any of those tools, is to kind of just do the exercises, getting on top of all the assets, getting your detections in place, getting it all in a single system where you can view what's in the network, where, how impacted it is, be able to run simulations against it to test it, and then obviously be able to also see where you are from a regulatory perspective. We showed some of those reports last time, but let's just look at kind of the recovery and response planning aspects of the CAF model, CAF standard. So we're going to be talking about the cybersecurity resilience bill and being the kind of guidance of the things you should do. And CAF will likely be and this is how you judge if you're doing a good job of doing them. It's got indicators of good practice. And we talk about recovery and response planning today. Also, the kind of things you should have: a response plan, recovery capability, testing, and exercises. But for response plan, it needs to be risk based. I think that's kind of a really interesting point. That it's not just because risk based. We tend to talk in financial terms, but I think that risk needs to include safety, business uptime, all those things. So, have you looked into this yet, Simon, in terms of the CAF standards that are coming around OT and how they might impact? Have you got any thoughts about regulatory standards, compliance guidelines that are really useful?
So we were very so I stepped down from BP at the end of 2020, but we were very early in the working with BAYS on the CAF. When it first came out, and NIS2, it was a directive then before it got into regulation. So we were quite involved with saying these things should be in there. I think that the challenge is just how practical some of the things in there were. I haven't read it recently, but again, I'll come back to the OT world's a lot about compensating controls, and certainly in the early days of conversations with the competent authority around this too, they really weren't up to speed on actually it's a really different world in OT. It's a really, really different world in OT. And therefore, there are some things that you would expect to see from the IT world that you're just never going to see in the OT world. Again, critical vulnerabilities, things like that's not being patched in the manner of like response preparedness. I think the bit I'll come back to, a lot of these things again tend to be isolated to OT or IT. You have to look at it end to end. You used the term earlier, Dom, about playbooks. Well, actually, if your playbooks are stored somewhere which is integrated into your Active Directory domain in your IT world, which is suddenly gone because you've been ransomed, you don't have any playbooks. So what do you do? And again, there'll be response playbooks and the engineering discipline is phenomenal around this. There'll be response planning at site. But it needs to be joined up. It needs to be what happens when the IT world and the OT world come together in the midst of an event, and how do you deal with that? So again, I'll come back to things like response plans, things like communications. So it can't just be in isolation, one or the other. It has to come together. And I don't see people doing that robustly. And I'm not sure the regulation really draws that out, i.e. what happens when your SharePoint's gone or your Active Directory's gone. I work for a company called Semprus, who are in the Active Directory space, and where we've just released a crisis management platform, which is completely isolated off domain for that very reason. Because actually, if it's a traditional IT attacker, the keys, they'll go after the keys to the kingdom, which is Active Directory. They'll use that to get themselves domain privileges, and then they'll destroy your backups and encrypt everything. And that the whole idea then is you don't have anything, even though you have potentially your OT assets segmented. You don't have the logistics systems there. You don't have any mechanism for communicating. You don't probably know who the single point of accountability is at site to call, the ops manager. What happens if they're away on holiday? Who's their second in command? You just don't have any of that information. And therefore, it has to be a robust end-to-end response preparedness.
Yeah, that sounds really imperative. And what we've seen obviously in the media for the past 12 months, some of the big attacks, particularly in retail, where they've come in through third-party SaaS platforms, found their way in and it's they've
I
not gone straight
massively feel
after.
for the likes of M&S, JLR. I mean, they're great teams who are doing the very best job they can. But you got humans in the loop, and all they're fallible. I have no idea what the background was to JLR shutting down production, whether actually it got into their OT network or if it was an IT logistics system. Nonetheless, regardless of whether it was or got into OT or not, the reality is probably if you don't have the logistics systems, you would have to shut the production line down anyway.
Yeah. So for the key messages, you need to look at it all as a holistic, coherent attack surface to understand the true business impacts of any part of the chain that kind of is no longer functioning or accessible.
And one thing again, I come back to the OT IT culture. Brilliant people on both sides of I'll call it the divide. There's a great opportunity to bring those people together. As I said, we had the OT Centre of Excellence under a guy called Ian Henderson. And underneath there, we regularly brought the asset owners together and we put them through different cyber training. So it was sort of giving them capability back. They brought their knowledge from OT into our environment. So our cyber guys recognise that actually your traditional approach in IT is not applicable in OT, back to compensating controls, etc. And that was hugely beneficial in terms of just a language and a cultural thing, understanding what was important to the people in the assets, also understanding what's important for the whole company and making sure that ultimately that we work for one company and the outcome of the business was what we both were attempting to achieve. But getting that common narrative, that sort of culture that integrated the two sides of the divide was really important way of maturing that whole conversation. That included like crisis preparedness, etc.
Yeah. So anything that kind of can you help unify across those divides as you put them? It's got to be incredibly useful for any business. Right. I think now is probably a good time to come on to Q&A. Emma, have we got anything in the...
We do, yes. We have had a few come through, so thank you very much for those who have engaged and got some questions over to us, and we did have one or two over prior to the session as well. The first one that I think flows on really nicely from what we were just discussing actually is, how does an organisation measure whether OT resilience has genuinely improved year on year beyond just compliance reporting?
So I think it's a great question. I think the two probably are somewhat linked because you naturally need the telemetry from the OT environment about how you mature in order to inform the IT. Inform the compliance. What I think in the OT space is actually don't try to make it too complicated. Actually, if you make it really complicated and you try to set sort of IT goals like patch SLAs or AV updates or anything like that, you're going to fail. You're immediately going to fail. So just have some really simple standards that you actually want to achieve, that you measure regularly in there. So do you have a competent person in the site? How many people have that? That's not a compliance control necessarily, but actually, are they trained? Do they have a backup if they're not around? Do they have USB and laptop controls? These are not difficult technical things. They're process and people things. And so having a set of fairly basic golden rules, standards, whatever you want to call them, that then you measure the organization to achieve. The other thing I would say is don't expect things to happen quickly. Nothing happens quickly in those environments because it's all about safety and production uptime. So you may have a big program. We had probably about an 8-year program to try and raise the maturity levels in the OT environment, and we reported that to the board regularly through the operational risk committees. And sometimes, things weren't going quickly enough, and we needed the help of the execs to put a bit of money and prioritization behind things to move it forward. But it was never gilding the lily. It was never about trying to get to those kind of IT SLAs that we have. It was always a practical set of standards that actually massively minimized the likelihood of an event happening.
Great, thank you, Simon. Dom, is there anything that you'd like to add onto that as well?
Yeah, we're obviously an interesting sales experience in terms of demonstrating that, in terms of reporting and tracking and kind of what kind of maturity scores as you tend to see from the IT world apply then? Does that kind of are the board looking for trends going upwards to the right?
Well, absolutely, absolutely, and of course, it's never linear, is it? It's you sometimes it's one step forward, two steps back, depending on the control that you're putting in place, and depending on kind of the assets, things change over time, etc. And of course, the standards as well. You have to continually look at those standards and make sure they're applicable to the environments that you're working in. But I mean, the IT world moved a lot faster than the OT in that respect. And like I said, we had down, thanks to Ian's expertise and agreeing it with the engineering team, we had kind of what we called baseline controls. They weren't gilding the lily, but they were very, very good people, process and technology controls that, like I said, got us to the position where we were comfortable. You're never 100% comfortable, but you were comfortable that the likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited in that environment was very, very low. The impact will always be very high, but the likelihood was very low.
Great, thank you, Simon. And we did have a longer question or comment that finished with a question that came through. So I have paraphrased. I hope that I've captured everything that this particular individual wanted to get across. But what I've paraphrased to is exercise planning should start with the board, followed by an introduction to relevant elements of cyber essential scheme, and then followed by actual exercise run by participants themselves within the organisation, not just driven by complete outsiders. What do you think?
So I think sometimes it's helpful, and I would say this because I'm a consultant, sometimes it's helpful to have an external actually facilitate the exercise because you get external perspective. Sometimes, if it's just internals in the organization, you can be a little bit myopic at times, and certainly we were. I think, and actually it helped to have a different perspective, give you a different view. That could be anything from actually this inject would drive a different conversation, through to actually being in the room. And I ran a crisis exercise. It wasn't actually in the OT environment with a privately held company, fairly big company in the UK. And the exercise was due to run for like 3 hours, and I think the first hour and a half was all about decision making, and because they'd never been through it. So having somebody externally come in and say, well, actually, that's interesting, but do you know if you make him the crisis director, you, the CEO, is going to have to do what he tells you to do? Are you prepared to do that? And so it was having somebody external to drive that can be helpful. I absolutely agree. The people in the room have to be the organization, and I'm a great believer in you've got to win the hearts and minds by going at the executive level first, because it's a business problem. It's not. For too long in security, we've made it dark arts and we've made it so complicated that people aren't engaged in the conversation. We have to get rid of that narrative. We have to turn it into business narrative and say, actually, the impact is going to be a business outage. Here's the trigger for the event. It happens to be a cyber issue in IT or OT, but actually do it in a narrative they can connect to. So I think that's really important, that through that crisis exercise, you're then able to engage those leaders that are then able to say, well, actually, I want my federated businesses to do crisis. Typically the engineers and the IT guys will have run their own sort of response plan exercises. If they don't, then well, they should do. But the bit that doesn't typically get engaged is the execs, who will be the people who need to make those big business decisions.
Thank you, Simon. Dom, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
That's it kind of sparks a thought actually while you were talking there, Simon. Have you ever been in one of those scenarios where they bring in third-party suppliers as well to kind of engage in that exercise?
So we didn't bring in third-party suppliers, but we did talk about supply chain as a big issue. And we had an event, Dom, actually, as a classic event of a cyber attack, not on us, not on BP. It was on a logistics provider in ANZ. They got hit twice. If you look it up, you'll find their name. I won't mention them, but they got hit twice within a period of about 3 months in Australia. The interesting thing was the impact of that was we couldn't get logistics. They dealt with the logistics, getting consumables into our retail stations. Because their systems were flawed, they couldn't deliver on their outcome, which meant we didn't get Mars bars or whatever it was into our retail stations. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of people go into retail stations not to buy fuel, they go in to buy consumables. And so the business then had to make a decision: are they prepared to open the store if they've got stockouts or not? So it was a cyber attack on a supplier that wasn't BP. It wasn't BP, it was a supplier to BP, but it impacted our business outcome. Now, the question you have to ask then is, why didn't we have supply chain diversity? Why didn't we have 2 suppliers that if one of them gets knocked out, you got another? Now, that's a question of risk and affordability, right? So it comes back to my point about everything's a business risk. That's what execs do. That's what they're paid to do. But I think that's a classic example of, we didn't necessarily bring them into the exercise, but in a real world event, how an attack on a supplier could actually end up hitting our business directly.